library, I found this box of letters and artwork that kids had sent to Rod, and he kept it. I mean, just the fact that he kept it, I think, says something about how flattered he was that these kids wrote these very astute letters to him about their reactions to Monsters Do on Maple Street, and so many of them said how much they loved Night Gallery. So it was kind of it was funny, because Rod's contentious relationship with Night Gallery, which I'm sure Jim and Scott will talk about. But they all were saying how much they loved Night Gallery, and how even though they weren't supposed to watch it because they were like 5th grade, and it was a little scary for them. But yeah, so he kept this box of correspondence from them, and it's still at the Ithaca College Library. So all right, let's see. I think we're probably going to be good here. Let's see. Yep. All right. There we go. Yay. Yeah.
Nick should take care of it for you.
Okay, yeah. So Caterpillar Tom, right?
No, it'd be this one.
Yeah?
This last one.
Okay.
Maybe we can.
You want me to just do it? Okay, yeah, you want to set it up? Okay. All right. So the authors of
Play the video.
Rod Serling's Night Gallery and After Hours Tour, Jim Benson and Scott Skelton. Say hello.
Thank you. Yes, I think a lot of you realize that the artist for Night Gallery, Tom Wright, was supposed to be here this weekend, and unfortunately, for various reasons, he was not able to make it. However, we do have somewhat of a consolation prize. We have a very short video of Tom talking about creating the Night Gallery paintings and working with Rod Serling. It's very short, it's about 3 minutes. And then after that, Mark Dawidziak will join us to moderate this panel.
The 1969 TV movie pilot for Night Gallery featured paintings by noted Universal Studios artist Jaroslav Gaber. However, when Night Gallery became a series the following year, producer Jack Laird hired artist Tom Wright. A graduate of the esteemed Chenard Art Institute, Tom Wright began working at Universal Studios as an illustrator for legendary directors Robert Wise and Alfred Hitchcock. Tom Wright was the only artist on Night Gallery, so he had to employ different styles and techniques to make the paintings appear that they had been created by many different artists, as Mr. Wright explains.
I wanted to try to do each painting where it didn't look like the same artist had done every painting. So that was a fun part of it, to try to change the style on every painting. That was part of the fun, though, because besides the occult, researching all of that material all the time, I was also researching all these artists, and a lot of the artists I didn't know or had ever heard of before, so it was a huge learning process, too.
Night Gallery creator, writer, and host Rod Serling was a big fan of Tom Wright's work, as Mr. Serling described.
Brilliant, young, versatile artist who sculpts and paints in water and paints in oils and does beautifully. No, they never do. They don't accept outside material, literary material. They don't accept outside painting. And my contract calls for maybe 1 out of 6 scripts and the sweeping of the studio on Friday evening.
Tom Wright not only worked closely with Night Gallery producer Jack Laird, but would also frequently meet with Rod Serling himself.
We would actually have lunch. We'd always have lunch. We'd just talk and talk about the paintings or talk about the show, and it was great. It was really great. So he was a very nice guy. It was my pleasure to really get to meet him and hang out with him for a little while anyway.
As Night Gallery grew in popularity, so did the popularity of Tom Wright's paintings. The studio and the network were besieged with questions and requests regarding the gallery paintings.
I mean, I remember when I was doing the show, I would get letters and inquiries from people who, like somebody in Illinois, let's say, who had just bought a bar, like a bar for themselves, and they wanted me to come back and do paintings for the walls in the bar, or do paintings, for their home, or paintings for, I mean, it was wild how popular they were.
Mark, have you been properly introduced?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
Nick gave
I
us
thought,
a...
oh, you mean Nick did it? Then you weren't properly.
Wise guy.
So you were introduced as the foremost experts on night gallery on the planet, correct?
That's exactly what Nick said, yes.
Well, all right, maybe so. He stole that from me. So all right. I asked these guys to send me some things they wanted to talk about. Jim sent me a list of 40 questions that he wanted me to ask them. Now, I have seen these guys respond to questions. If we get through 5 of them, we will be doing great. So let me start with, I like this one to start with, which is, how did Night Gallery impact the two of you two growing up? You were both aware of it in its original run?
Yes.
Go ahead, Scott.
Well, I remember vividly seeing the pilot film. It was November of 1969. I had just turned 10. And I had seen a few Twilight Zones before that. I remember those vividly too, but I really wasn't aware of them during the original run, only in reruns. Night Gallery really, scared the living hell out of me for one, but I became fascinated by it, and when the series began, I was a captive audience at the time. It was my first introduction really to Rod Serling's writing, so I have a real tender spot for it. As much as I love Twilight Zone, Night Gallery was my first introduction to Rod Serling's writing, and it really caught my imagination. It lit me on fire. How about you?
Well, for some strange reason, I was an odd kid because I really wasn't into cartoons and, kind of kiddie television. I never saw Sesame Street growing up. I was fascinated with anthologies, and I loved The Twilight Zone, and I loved anything related to Rod Serling. And when I saw originally the first season of Night Gallery, which was in 1970, the final episode of that season was they're tearing down Tim Riley's bar. And even though I was about 8 years old at the time, it caused me to have a midlife crisis. And it affected me in such a profound way. I absolutely fell in love with that show based on their tearing down Tim Riley's bar. I also liked the iconoclastic aspect of the show, and its kooky quality, its unusual quality, how separate and different it was, how unconventional it was from the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone was conventional. It was unconventional. But Night Gallery was like way out there and really reflected the attitudes of the time and how America was changing. And that really captivated me as well.
I mentioned this last year when we did a virtual panel about how the first edition of their book was not only such a great addition to Rod Serling's scholarship, but was, to my mind, the best researched, most thorough look at the making of a TV series. And you're looking at somebody who's written exactly that kind of book on Columbo and the Night Stalker. So I'm not just throwing roses at these guys. The first version of that book knocked my proverbial socks off. So why did you guys think there was any need for another edition?
It kind of grew organically. Jim and I had talked about trying to secure our rights to the book away from Syracuse University Press, who we had a great relationship with, but we had to make some concessions in that first one, and it had to be a certain page length. We could only use black and white photos of a very small vintage, and Night Gallery is, if anything, extremely visual show. We had greater ambitions for it. So we were thinking of putting it online, or at least in some sort of ebook form with more visuals. And so I began the process of putting back into the text all the stuff we were required to remove to make it a certain page length. And after the success of our Art of Darkness book, which focused only on the making of the paintings and what happened to them afterward, the publisher said we really ought to do a second edition of your book. And that's when we began to do serious thought about expanding it greater, even beyond what we'd written before, adding the more material that we'd learned in the 25 years since we'd written it the first time, and make it a richer, thicker, heavier book altogether. When the publisher said, well, let's add all the paintings in too, and it became like, okay, this is what we first had in mind when we started writing this book.
Well, the other thing is, any author will tell you this, and certainly Mark will tell you this, that when you write a book, people come out of the woodwork and they say, oh, I've got this, and I've got that, and I've got this, and I've got that.
Where were you?
Yeah, exactly, right. And so what happened was, just a few months after we originally published our first book, we found an archive of behind-the-scenes night gallery photos, color, black and white, behind the scenes, incredible stuff. And we thought, oh my God, it's too bad we didn't have this for our first book. And of course, our first book, even though Syracuse was fantastic, they limited us to 100 images to our book. So the fact that we had that treasure trove, that got us thinking, oh my God, we could double the size of our book, which we did. And then in addition to that, we were determined to track down everyone that we couldn't find when we originally wrote our first book for various reasons. And in the 20 years since we wrote the first book, the internet had changed to the point where you can find virtually anybody. And so we ended up interviewing Leslie Ann Warren and Sally Field and Joan Van Ark, people who we absolutely would have no chance of getting 20 years ago. And then the last thing is newspapers.com, very frankly. Any author who is not using newspapers.com, who is writing a book like this, is really missing a bet, because it's the history of everything. And so we found quotes and stories and anecdotes and information and facts that we didn't know existed, and so we put sometimes whole articles from these newspapers who had covered Night Gallery at the time, some extraordinary insights from TV critics, and information about the show. So that's what expanded our book to over 800 pages.
But also we found, of course, more quotes, clips of Serling himself, stuff that we'd never been able to dig up because the internet was this font of new information, stuff that we'd never heard him say about Night Gallery before, and stuff in newspapers too, so we could enrich it with even more input from the man who created it himself.
I know that there's a tendency historically in Rod Serling's scholarship to sort of dismiss Night Gallery as lesser Twilight Zone, a last act that didn't produce all that much. Your first book pretty much shot that theory all to hell, but this one really comes through to say this is an incredibly important show to Rod Serling's career. So why is Night Gallery important?
It is Rod Serling's final foray into TV production, TV writing for TV, before he essentially retired and started teaching. I think he felt he didn't have the same juice he had when he started. I think he was realizing with his Night Gallery experience that his, what do you want to call it, his fame had not carried forward as he'd liked. He thought his name over the title of Night Gallery would give him essentially last say in creative issues, and he did not, to his I'm sure his feelings that he should have probably he should have taken an executive role. He should have been a showrunner. But he didn't want to give that much time away from raising his family, so he didn't do it. And Jack Laird became the showrunner. And that became the problem, because he did not have the same relationship to the producer that he did on Twilight Zone. He had Buck Houghton there, who was an extraordinary sympathetic producer. He and Rod were on the same wavelength, and he and Jack Laird were oil and water. Jack was not interested in having the same sort of viewpoint that the Twilight Zone had. He was far more interested in being more out there, more revolutionary, more unusual in the choice. He was willing to take that energy from the 70s that was taking over and let Night Gallery run with that, which led to a highly varied set of tales, but not all of them were what Rod Serling would have okayed. Still, Jack was an excellent showrunner. He just didn't agree with Rod on choice of stories. Now, there were some great writers on Night Gallery, but Rod still wrote 1/3 of them. And there was a rumor for years that he had nothing at all to do with it. Essentially, he just had his name on it, but that's not true. He wrote a lot of the stories, and some of them are some of the best stuff he ever wrote, in my opinion. That's why it's important to me. It carries forward Rod's Twilight Zone legacy and brought out some brilliant episodes, as inconsistent as the show was.
That's right, and beyond that, what made Night Gallery important in my view is it was a collection of extraordinary talent both in front of and behind the camera. The artisans who worked on Night Gallery were really the last generation to have worked with the great classic filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles. The DP, Lionel Linden on Night Gallery worked, he was the assistant DP, I believe, on The Manchurian Candidate and gave that film an extraordinary look. It also launched, because of, at least in part because of Jack Laird, it launched an amazing amount of careers, again, both behind and in front of the camera. Of course, it was the first thing that Steven Spielberg ever directed. It was the first thing that Leonard Nimoy ever directed. It was the first television production that John Astin ever directed. And it was the first dramatic debut role for Diane Keaton, Mark Hamill, Lindsay Wagner. It was only her second role in her career.
Randy Quaid, I believe.
Yeah, Randy Quaid, and the list, you can just go on and on and on. And again, a lot of the reason for that was producer Jack Laird, because he gave young people a chance who maybe other producers wouldn't, and he went out of his way to help people in the business, which is very rare. Just ask anybody in that business.
Let me return to that, though, because there have actually been not the best biographical treatments of Rod that has suggested that after the Twilight Zone, he wrote nothing of consequence.
That's correct.
I think one of the things that your book does is it just demolishes that notion.
Yes, there were 2 biographies of Serling. I will not dignify their authors by mentioning their name, both of whom shared a baseless thesis that Rod Serling, somehow the end of his life was a tragedy of lost opportunities, that he was a bright star that faded out, that he lost his ability to write anything of any substance, which is horse shit. He did not lose. I mean, you don't go from 5 years down the road and do like The Loner in between and come to Night Gallery and suddenly you lose all your juice. You don't do that as a writer. He had not written himself out, and so he still had some really important things to say. He realized with Twilight Zone that getting stuff past the censors was probably a lost cause, but he wrote so many dramas for Night Gallery that still have the stamp of his passion about justice, about things that are right and wrong, a moral compass that is absolutely unmistakable. I mean, even if the story seems like it has characters that aren't really saying anything, just listen carefully, and Rod's voice is there, and he's giving you the same, the same kind of, what do you want to call, morality tales that he would have done for the Twilight Zone.
You could compare any of Rod's best work on Night Gallery to Rod's best work on the Twilight Zone. Episodes like Class of '99, episodes like The Messiah on Mott Street, They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar, Cool Air. what fascinated Scott and I is the fact that when we wrote our first book, we had a pre-sale for our first book, and we got an order from Mexico from this guy named Guillermo del Toro. And we thought, oh, great, this is fantastic. We're getting a sale from Mexico. And we had no idea that he was a film director. And, of course, now he is an Academy Award-winning film director, and perhaps, you know, the most important, at least, horror director currently in existence. And he is a huge Night Gallery fan. He became a director because of Rod Serling's Night Gallery.
Yes.
And pardon the expression, but he prefers, by his own admission, he prefers Night Gallery over Twilight Zone. And he was kind enough to do forwards for two of our books. And he actually makes an interesting argument. He said that Night Gallery would not have its level of quality unless it had had the conflict between Jack Laird and Rod Serling. They actually helped each other because Rod brought his brand of storytelling, unique storytelling, and humanity to Night Gallery, and Jack Laird brought in classic 19th century fantasy fiction from, you know, classic short stories from tremendous authors like H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth. And I'm not sure, it's arguable, but I'm not sure if Rod Serling would have been emphasizing those stories as heavily as Laird, who was an inveterate reader, and he formed the show that way, and actually helped Rod Serling in that sense, because some of Serling's best work were adaptations of those classic short stories.
He made a mention of it in a quote that we found after our first book, of course, that were he to continue with Night Gallery, he would entirely cut out any of the comic vignettes and focus solely on adapting stories like Lovecraft. And he used Lovecraft specifically because I'm sure he had Cool Air in mind, which is one of his adaptations, one of his finest. And I just hold that up to anyone who thinks that Rod Serling had somehow lost his way or could not write for certain characters. It was just brilliantly done.
Actually, Cool Air, an H.P. Lovecraft story, he improves it.
Yes, he does.
Yes, he does.
Doesn't he? And not only that, it shoots down the notion Rod couldn't write good women's roles, which was already not true. You know, you look at several Twilight Zones to disprove that. But, you know, and that's right in the beginning of Rod's career. He was always good at adapting other people's work.
Yes.
That's right on through his whole career. So he did that on Twilight Zone. He wins an Emmy for The Comedian, which is an adaptation.
Yes, that's true.
So you see that right on through. And I'm going to do a little commercial for these guys right now. We're going to have a little break because I don't know how many of you have purchased their book. They told me the price of their book when it was first published, and I went, not because it was so expensive, because I thought, you're selling it that cheap? I couldn't believe when I saw that book that that's all you were asking for, because I know what goes into publishing. And I know how much when you add color plates, and this is nothing but color. I can't believe they found as many color stills as they did. You know, all I can tell you is this book is one of the best bargains out there. And, you know, I wouldn't say that on a book that costs that much, except it is worth, you know, if ever the phrase, it's worth every penny, it's for this book.
Well, if you look at I'm like blaming this on other factors, but let's face it, inflation has been a killer of late. I mean, when our first book sold in '98, it was $35, and that was
that was considered a lot. That was 1997. That was considered a lot.
Yeah.
But if you take a $95 price tag on our book now and take it back to '98, it's under $50. So you're getting so much more book
good
for
point.
essentially the same price.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
But once again, as impressed as I was with the first edition, I still haven't gotten over this new edition. I'm still, you know, shaking my head. You can get lost in this book. You can open it to any point, start reading it, and you lose time. You lose hours reading what these guys have done. It is that thorough. It is that impressive. And as I said before, I don't impress easily on this front. So now I'm going to ask you guys a question. I don't even know the answer to this, and as long as I've known you both, how did you meet?
Online.
Really?
And it wasn't a dating site.
Since there was no internet when you guys met.
Yeah, back in the Stone Age, I had created a website, nightgallery.net, to, I was starting to think about creating a book on Night Gallery. I thought, here's a subject I can write about, because I had seen what had happened on the Sci-Fi Channel, which was playing at the time. It's the syndication version of the show, which is a travesty. It resembles in no way what I remember as a child. And I was so upset by that, I said, I got to write about this. I got to write about the original so that we never lose it. And I created a website to start talking about Night Gallery, posting things about it, seeing where there was any interest in it. Well, I started organizing research for the book. And Jim contacted me through that, and we started talking on the phone. And it was clear we were kindred spirits on this issue. We both loved, TV that we grew up with, and we had a particular love of this show. And Jim told me he had done research for some folks who had done some Night Gallery articles for the Twilight Zone magazine. He had a ton of stuff, and I said, well, look, you're already started on this project, and I'm beginning it. Let's join forces and write this thing together, because, I've got to work for a living, and I can't write it all the time. And he says, sure. And that's how we first met.
Yeah, we talked for about 2 weeks at least.
I think it
was about 2 weeks. And I was genuinely, authentically surprised that Scott was willing to bring me on as a co-author, and I was incredibly honored. And I wasn't thinking about it because at the time I had a mail order business where I was selling TV memorabilia. And so my head was not really in that space, even though, it admittedly in the past I had thought about, I would have loved to have been an author of a Night Gallery book. And so it just totally made sense. And also, Scott had already written the foundation of the book, and so I thought, I was confident that I could add to that, add value, and maybe go in some other different directions that Scott hadn't thought of, and vice versa. And so we developed a collaboration that still exists and works to this day. We work incredibly well together, and we are so grateful because not all co-authors do work well together.
Yeah, and he is a pit bull when it comes to research. I've never seen anyone throw themselves into finding every last. He could be a paralegal. He's that good. He will dig out precedents and photographs, and it's just, he's a marvelous partner to work with.
Let me ask you about the arc of Night, because Night Gallery starts as not a weekly series. It obviously starts as a TV movie first. Then, it is once every 4 week. Then there's the second season, and then there's the third season. But a lot of people think the second season is the height of the moment, that this is what Night Gallery should be best remembered for. What went right in the second season?
Well, it started off, they had 20 episodes instead of 6 having to do, and Rod wrote the balance of almost everything in the first season. There was, I think, one segment that was written by Hal Dresner, and the rest of it was all Rod's. But Rod couldn't possibly produce enough material for 22 episodes. He produced a lot of it, but that's when Jack Laird's team kicked in, and they began bringing on other writers to the show. Guys that were, like Rod, had worked in early television, like Halstead Wells and Alvin Sappinsley, Robert Bloch, Richard Matheson, his old buddy from Twilight Zone, to start bringing in scripts. It got off to a kind of a rocky footing because it introduced what a lot of people feel is a sort of a betrayal of sorts. He would bring in little short comic vignettes in the style of Love American Style, which was another TV period, a show from the time that you may or may not remember, that had little burlesque-style blackouts that were intended to make you guffaw. But putting it in a show that is ostensibly horror is kind of odd because it breaks the mood every other episode to bring in, another segment in, and then have to go back to something horror-oriented after you've had this ridiculous skit on Count Dracula hiring a babysitter or something. But when the second season really hit its stride was about, I'd say, halfway through.
Yes.
When the comic vignettes dried up and disappeared, and then some of the best scripts that Serling had on file came out, stuff like The Caterpillar and Lindemann's Catch and Deliveries in the Rear, stuff that was really rich and interesting, and even the critics began to notice that the quality of the show got measurably better, and they began mentioning it. But by that time, I think Rod Serling had felt so betrayed by a couple of segments in which his stuff was rewritten. There were two, in fact, that we found that were more than heavily rewritten, that he stopped watching the show just as it was really getting good. So that Rod never saw some of those shows, I think, that began to get better. But it also introduced Jack Laird's kind of wild, improvisatory attitude toward filmmaking, bringing in young directors with new ideas. He was a fiend about letting young directors with very little experience come on board just to get some fresh ideas on the table. He didn't want stale journeymen to take over. He wanted some people with a little more, who had a little more skin in the game. It meant a lot more to them to be able to direct because they hadn't directed much before. So we got guys like Janos Fork and John Badham, young guys who really brought more to the table than some guy who'd been bored by it for 20 years. John Astin got his first shot on a few of them,
Right, and also that was the year that Director of Photography Gerald Perry Finnerman could really, stretch his artistic wings. Now, he was the DP on the original Star Trek. So when you see the very moody, dark lighting and the concentration of emphasizing people's eyes and things like that, he brought those techniques to Night Gallery, which visually made it an even better show. And like Scott mentioned earlier, after they eliminated the vignettes, and I think that was a edict from NBC and Universal. Everybody hated the vignettes except Jack Laird. Once they got those out of the way, then basically you had an hour-long Twilight Zone with 2 half hours in an hour. And all the stories were fully fleshed out. Everything worked. It looked like a Twilight Zone when you have the best writing, the best director, the best stars. And that was another thing. By that point, Night Gallery had a reputation in Hollywood. So some of the top stars in Hollywood
readers in Columbo's point of view, this isn't a good idea. You can't stretch these things out to 2 hours and not have them material. They didn't want to. William Link and Richard Levinson were the showrunners on Columbo, and they said, we can't sustain this. We can't keep spinning this out. It's a cat and mouse game. They'll get bored. What Larry White wanted to do hurt both Columbo and, of course, Night Gallery.
And that's the irony of it, is that they didn't want to go to 2 hours. They thought Columbo was as much a 90-minute show as the Twilight Zone was a half-hour show.
Yes.
Trying to push the Twilight Zone to an hour was hard. Trying to push Columbo to 2 hours, and it hurt Night Gallery.
Right, and Jack Laird believed that Night Gallery should be an hour show, because then you could give stories an opportunity like Tim Riley's Bar to stretch them out to 40 minutes, and then have shorter stories that were appropriate for a shorter time, like 20 minutes, and then you fill out the whole hour.
It was one of the great things about Night Gallery. What the directors would tell us is that we had this writing, they would bring you a script, and it would be 30 minutes, it could be 20 minutes, it could be 40 minutes, but it wasn't jammed into this Procrustean bed where you had to fit into these. You have to have a half an hour of commercial time, so you've got a 25-minute show, and it's exactly 25 minutes. The story took as long as it took to tell the story in an intelligent way, and for that, that's why the rhythms of Night Gallery in its original form were so satisfying, because there really wasn't a need to cram this into that particular format. The format dictated how long the story was given to tell itself out.
And that was another reason why NBC hated the show, is because it did not conform to the normal structure of television. Half an hour, or is it half an hour or an hour? Well, wait a minute. We have 4 segments that make up an hour, and also because of that, it naturally costs more, because you have to have 4 different sets, 4 different sets of actors, crew, etc., and it just economically didn't make sense. But they particularly did not like the fact that it was a non-linear series in a linear medium.
You've already alluded to the fact that Rod and Jack were not the most compatible. They weren't the Scott and Jim of their time. They certainly did not get along very well. And it was kind of a catch-22 for Rod, wasn't it? Because on the one hand, he did not want to work as hard as he did on the Twilight Zone. He did not want to have all those pressures. And at the same time, he conceded artistic control, thinking, of course, that they would listen to him. So this was the crucial decision, though, wasn't it?
Yes.
He could have been on Night Gallery what he was on Twilight Zone.
Yep.
But just not interested at that moment, and that sealed the deal.
Yeah. The shadows began to appear, I'm sure, in Rod's mind in the very first season, which only had 6 episodes. But on 2 occasions we know of, in Little Black Bag, his script was rewritten by Jack Laird, not rewritten per se, as much as some of the scenes were moved around to what Jack thought was more dramatically appropriate. And I have a copy of a very civil letter from Rod to Jack, essentially telling him, in the nicest terms, put it back the way it was. This ruins the wild effect I'm looking for. Unfortunately, Rod had also written at the very end, one of the characters sort of commits suicide on screen. You don't see it. He tells you to shoot it from behind, but a character draws a knife across his neck and accidentally, commits suicide. And that just wouldn't fly with the censors, so Jack rewrote the ending of it so you didn't have to see that. They just talk about it. The other problem he had was with Tim Riley's Bar, and that took a little detective work. It took about 25 years before he figured out what happened there, because we were getting interviews with people like William Wyndham, who was the star of the show, and one of the actresses who played a smaller role. I remembered that the script originally had a more downbeat ending. They had essentially cut off where the character Randy Lane is sort of redeemed and allowed to, have a happier ending by his boss hiring him back. It was just truncated, and he sees the ghosts of his happier past fading away, and he's left despondent amid the rubble of this old, childhood meeting place that he had with his friends, and just crying in the rain. That was Jack Laird's story. He didn't like the upbeat ending or the sentiment involved, and it was obviously seriously what Rod wanted, because in every draft of it I ever saw, that was the ending. Rod didn't make the change. It had to be Jack Laird, and we found a script from one of the actors, John Randolph, with the pages marked at the top as replacements, where the ending was put back. I'm sure Rod found out about it and complained vociferously. So Jack did what he wanted, but the second season would begin to show a few more potent conflicts between the two, and that's when it really began to get ugly. Two of Rod's scripts, I think two of them, Fear of Spiders was rewritten in part, but not by an actor, by one of the, not by a writer, one of the actors on the show, Kim Stanley, began to improvise. And so that was changed, but one of them, The Dear Departed, was stem to stern changed. I mean, all the scenes were there, all the characters were there, but all the dialogue had been changed.
Midnight Never Ends.
Was that Midnight Never Ends?
Well, both of them. Yeah.
And Midnight Never Ends.
Yeah.
Midnight Never Ends was changed. So was Dear
Yeah, so was it, yeah.
But Jack did Dear Departed. Gerald Sanford had rewritten Midnight Never Ends, and they have Rod's name on them only, but you look far and wide to try to find any of his flavorful dialogue. It's all written by somebody else.
Well, as we wrote, Rod Serling assumed that they would defer to his creative input. Now, I think that might have happened if William Sackheim, who produced the Night Gallery pilot, had stayed on to the regular series Night Gallery, but he didn't want to. He was like Rod Serling. He said, I've been through that before. I'm burned out. I don't want, to be a producer of a full-time series. So it was bad luck for Rod Serling that he ended up with Jack Laird. And Jack Laird used to be an actor. And we think that he was a bit jealous of Rod Serling. And there is evidence of this, that in the first couple of years of Night Gallery, I think, personally, that he hired a PR agent, because there are all these articles in newspapers across the country about Jack Laird does this, and how wonderful he is, and here's his biography. That was virtually unheard of in the early 70s, talking about producers. This is years before producers became stars like Stephen Bochco and Stephen J. Cannell and Aaron Spelling and people like that. And if you notice, in the opening credits of Rod Serling's Night Gallery, the first and second season, they're huge font, Rod Serling's Night Gallery, and then equally large font, produced by Jack Laird. He made sure that he was going to have equal credit on that show.
I remember asking Grace Curzio, who was at the time Jack Laird's secretary. She retyped all the scripts and stuff like that, and she used to hear, because she was right outside Jack's door, the arguments he'd have with Rod on the phone. And I asked her point blank, what do you think? Why did Jack have such a problem with Rod Serling? And the only thing that came out, the only thing that she could come up with, she said, I really don't know. I suspect professional jealousy. Jack wanted to be the star as producer, and Rod Serling kept getting in his way. He really wanted the show to be his, and I think that's why he was less than civil about the idea of allowing Rod some kind of creative input on script choices and casting.
Yeah, Jack Laird was nominated for an Emmy for a Ben Casey episode that he wrote. I remember Lemon Tree. He was up against Rod Serling that same year, but I think it went to Reginald Rose for The Defenders. But still, he was watching Rod Serling win Emmy after Emmy after Emmy every single year for The Twilight Zone. And I think that really engendered a lot of resentment and a lot of jealousy, which set up the conflict that occurred approximately 7 years later.
Talk a little bit about this, but talk a little bit about we acknowledge, and we talked about earlier about the impact of The Twilight Zone what impact did Night Gallery have on the pop culture and TV going forward and horror and just everything going forward?
It's funny, when you read some of the critiques by TV critics, most of whom aren't creative people anyway, that you would have been different. But I mean, Cleveland Avery
Just cleared his head.
Cleveland Avery, was a typical of the time. He didn't understand the format and he gave it a bad review. But the problem was, Night Gallery's fans were all younger, and they understood. There was a few perceptive critics. Mark would have been one of them. One of them from a San Francisco paper, who at the end of the second season said, "This is really more than people are giving it credit for. This is really a fascinating show. It should be watched more completely than people are giving it credit for." But what proves out is all those younger people who were fans who grew up, and all of them are saying the Night Gallery was as big an influence on them too. And the biggest fan of all is Guillermo del Toro, who claims that his very art is informed by Night Gallery, and you can see it in everything he does. And he'll point it out to you when you ask him, that aspect of your first film, Kronos. He says, yes, that was based on a Feast of Blood episode of Night Gallery.
Pan's Labyrinth also has,
Pan's Labyrinth.
and The Shape of Water, Lindemann sketch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pan's Labyrinth, the fascination with children, children and the elderly, which he said was one of Serling's big themes, the themes of the disenfranchised in society, and who's more disenfranchised than children and elderly who have no power. And so you watch Guillermo del Toro, these themes keep recurring, this sensitivity toward the travails of the young and the elderly. So what influence does it have? Well, it's being played out today.
Well, right, yeah, people, it's a relatively small number of people, I guess, because 50 years later, a lot of people have passed on. But like Scott said, the largest demographic of Night Gallery was young people, and especially young people in urban neighborhoods. They did a poll at the time in 1972. It was the #1 rated show in the Bronx, in New York, and in Detroit, and in Atlanta.
Houston.
And in Houston, that's right. And I think it was Jeannot Zorc who said that if they had judged Night Gallery's ratings based solely on its demographics, it would still be playing today. But that was not valued demographics as it is today. And so, and also at the time, the impact it had on social media was extraordinary, because I remember everyone that I've talked to about around my age, which is somewhere around 60. The thing about Night Gallery is, if there was a particularly extraordinary episode, the next day at school, all the kids were talking about it. All the boys were talking about it, especially the caterpillar. The caterpillar, to this day, there are people who are afraid of earwigs. And even though earwigs, I think, are not terribly dangerous, but there are still, and Guillermo del Toro said he's more scared of earwigs than sharks, after watching Jaws.
Well, I told you these guys would chew up the time, because we got through about maybe that much to talk about. But indeed, you still have a chance to buy their book. You still guys have
Absolutely, yeah. We've
Go out, buy, and if you've got follow-up questions, by all means, they're the guys. If you've got a question about Night Gallery, if you've got anything you want to ask them. I do. And I think everybody out there who studied with Rod Serling and studies his work, they're going to be the first stop on this topic. So,
questions?
do we have time for questions?
Do we have time?
I might have time for a couple, sure.
All right.
Just shout them out if you can.
I got a question. Is there any chance ever to see the original uncut episodes, or is it just the syndicated one? That's it.
That's a bit of a problem. I mean, if you want to invest in either of the DVD or Blu-ray sets, which are still out there. That's the way you can see them, I believe. Is it Apple TV?
Well, it actually, the uncut episodes just a couple of weeks ago made their debut on Apple TV. So you can literally buy the entire series if you want to buy it for $24 on Apple TV.
However, the vast number of times you can see it out there on any of the services, they will still be using the butchered syndication version, which I promise you will not make any fans of the show. The original is the only one to see because it's the only one that hasn't been cut to shreds and jammed into a half-an-hour slot.
But I think the state-of-the-art release on this was the Kino Lorber Blu-ray version of this. They really did it right. One of the reasons Kino Lorber really did it right is because these guys oversaw the whole thing.
Well, at least they let us do some commentaries.
Yes.
But
They had input.
They've been clued in that we were the people that could help them with that. I think they finally figured that out with the Kolchak the Night Stalker one, where they should have had you running the show. They were.
Let's not get personal.
The last hour they allowed.
No, Mark's right. Kino Lorber, especially the second season and the third season on Blu-ray, that is the definitive Night Gallery release. Big tons of extras, tons of audio commentary, tons of visuals, documentaries, analysis of the paintings, and they did a beautiful job remastering it and kicking it up to Blu-ray quality. And yeah, I mean that's really the way to see it. And I'm sure the same. If you're only interested in the episodes, the same remastered qualities are available on Apple TV.
That Blu-ray and their book and your set for Night Gallery heaven.
How closely related do you think Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities is to Night Gallery?
Yes.
It's a photocopy. I mean, I understand what he was trying to do. And if Night Gallery was going to be rebooted, I would say, this is the guy you want running the show. I've seen Cabinet of Curiosities. I'm not going to say all of them are, masters of the medium, but there's a number of them in there, like Night Gallery, that were really outstanding. But I'm sure he was influenced by Night Gallery. There's no.
Oh, absolutely. Guillermo adapted Pickman's model, which Night Gallery adapted 50 years ago. And Guillermo was clearly inspired by that. I have no evidence of this, but we do not blame Guillermo at all for not crediting Night Gallery for Cabinet of Curiosities. My personal opinion, I have no evidence of this, is that Netflix probably did not appreciate him associating their new show with a show that hardly anybody remembers or knows. And Hollywood has this bad habit of presenting older material that's been rebooted as original material, never have ever been produced before. So basically they can rip things off and not give due credit.
How much contact, just to follow up, how much contact do you guys have with Guillermo since you wrote the forward to the book? Is there any more discussions? The question is leading to, do you think that because of his documentary on Night Gallery, will he create more Cabinet of Curiosities so we would get more entertainment in that thing?
Well, we were just talking about this, and as far as I know, they haven't announced it being renewed. And I think part of that reason is Guillermo, and this is actually a good quality, Guillermo says yes to everything. That people offer him things and he can't help himself. He just says, yes, I'll do it, yes, I'll do it, yes, I'll do it. So he overbooks himself, and then he ends up not being able to fulfill a lot of promises. I don't know if that's the case here, but I do know if you look at IMDb, all the properties that are in pre-production that he's either producing or directing or writing, there's like 15 projects, and right now he's overseas directing Frankenstein, which is another one of his passion projects.
This is the last time to do everything was here.
One book now and egg two. Favorite painting /
That is an evil question.
It is an evil question.
Favorite painting?
and or
So whichever one
I can say almost everybody's, well, we can judge by, because we also sell posters of the paintings, and many of which are, and they're here, many of which are signed by artist Tom Wright. And I can tell you which ones everyone seems to love, and that's Lone Survivor, The Cemetery, which was not painted by Tom Wright, that was from the pilot, and The Caterpillar, which we screened last night, and also The Funeral. That's a big seller.
That's my favorite. Yeah. You just mentioned, and I would not argue it's one of the best episodes, but it is my favorite of the paintings.
And I know
Beautiful, really beautiful. Our favorite episodes?
I'd have to go more with my intellect on this. The perfect episode in terms of writing, casting, and production, I would say, is The Caterpillar. However, I mean, even Guillermo says, this is shot like a movie. It looks like a movie. It's a 32-minute movie. It's cinematic to the nth degree with classic, classic style of visualization that John Ford would be happy with. But my heart goes to stuff like Tim Riley's Bar and Messiah on Mont Street, because I think in those, Rod's personal sort of view was far more prominent. They were very personal to him. And because I love Rod Serling, I love those a lot too.
I absolutely agree with Scott, and not because I don't want him upset with me, because the Caterpillar, if you look at the history of television, there are very few times that you catch lightning in a bottle, where everything is perfect up and down the line. Perfect cast, perfect director, perfect writer, perfect art direction. Everything about that show is perfect. Everything just fell together perfectly. If you look at the cast, it's amazing. You have Joanna Pettit, you have Lawrence Harvey, perhaps his best late performance. You have John Williams, Hitchcock's favorite. You have Don Knight playing the villain. You have Tom Helmore, another great character actor. And then you have Jeannot Sword, who directed 22 night galleries more than any other director, arguably the best director on the show. And his staging, his pacing, the movement of the camera, everything was perfect. And Rod Serling's script and the ending, incredible.
Yeah.
Perfect. And Gerald Perry Finneran's cinematography.
Yes, which is one of his high points. The script itself is like a perfect short story. Everything is timed to that final effect, and the build to it is perfect, not a hair out of place. And it's just, short and sweet and beautifully done. So I would say The Caterpillar has to be the top of the pigs.
That's right.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. Before we get out of here, I just a couple quick things. As you'll probably see on your schedule, we were supposed to be doing a raffle drawing right now. And as you probably noticed, we never sold any raffle tickets. The good news is that we got so many donations for raffle items, well over 100, I think, that's the good news. The bad news is it was so many, it just became unwieldy, and we really just didn't even know how to set this thing up. We had so much else going on, as I'm sure you understand. So we're almost certainly going to be doing an online raffle of all the items that were donated to us. So stay tuned to rodserling.com or our Facebook page, and we'll be announcing that really, really soon, like in the next few days or so. So that is that, and hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks for coming.